Morrison's first professional audition lasted exactly 8 minutes before they stopped him. But what happened in the hallway outside the studio afterward created something no one expected. September 14, 1964, Morrison was sitting in the dim waiting room of Sunset Sound Studios, Los Angeles, California. His hands were shaking so badly, he almost dropped the whiskey bottle he was holding. He took one last sip, put the bottle back in his bag, and took a deep breath. The executives from Columbia Records were waiting inside. This was Morrison's first real chance. After being kicked out of UCLA Film School, he had lived on Venice Beach for months, reading poetry on the streets, introducing himself as someone who knew nothing about music. But when he started singing in nightclubs, people stopped. They watched. And now he was in this room. Morrison had never done an audition like this before. He'd sung at school shows, read poems to friends. But this was different. This was real. Columbia Records was a giant company. If he failed here, he might never get another chance. The sound technician opened the door. "Ready?" he said. Morrison stood up. He wasn't ready, but he went in anyway. If you want to hear Morrison's unknown stories, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every week we share the Doors' hidden moments with you. The studio was cold and silent. 3 men sat behind the glass partition, taking notes, their faces expressionless. The man in the middle was Harold Levinson, Columbia Records' new talent director, 42 years old, someone with 20 years of experience in the industry. Levinson had listened to thousands of young musicians over the years and rejected most of them. For him, this was just a job. This was the 10th audition of the morning. There were 5 more before lunch. He didn't even remember Morrison. He hadn't even looked at his face when he called his name. He'd just said, "Begin." Morrison approached the microphone, his hands still shaking. He put the whiskey bottle he'd taken from his bag in the corner of the studio. But Levinson noticed. He frowned, but said nothing. Morrison began to sing. When the first notes came out, the technician noticed. His voice, it was strange, deep, dark, almost threatening, but beautiful. Levinson raised his head and looked at Morrison for the first time. The young man had closed his eyes, singing as if he were somewhere else. The words were weird, poetic, seemingly meaningless, but somehow impactful. Levinson started taking notes. Maybe there was something about this kid. Maybe he was different. Maybe. Then Morrison stopped in the middle of the song. He opened his eyes and looked at the glass partition. "This is wrong," he said. Levinson turned on the microphone. "What's wrong?" Morrison didn't answer. He walked to the corner, picked up the whiskey bottle, took another sip, and came back. The 2 men next to Levinson looked at each other. This wasn't professional. This was unacceptable. But Levinson said nothing. He just said, "Continue." Morrison started the second song, but this time his voice was different. Harsher, more uncontrolled, more angry. He was mumbling the lyrics, sometimes forgetting them, sometimes making them up. Levinson stopped taking notes. Disappointment showed on his face. 4 minutes passed. Morrison was still singing, but no one was listening anymore. Levinson looked at his watch, thinking about lunch plans. Then Morrison took a step, stumbled, and couldn't hold the microphone stand. The stand fell to the ground. The sound of metal clashing filled the studio. As Morrison tried to keep his balance, the whiskey bottle slipped from his pocket and shattered on the floor. Glass shards scattered everywhere. 8 minutes had passed. Levinson stood up, turned on the microphone, and said 2 words. "That's enough." Morrison froze. He looked at the men behind the glass partition. No one was moving. Levinson repeated, this time harsher, "Get out." Morrison didn't say anything. He put the microphone down, didn't even look at the broken whiskey bottle, and walked to the door. The technician let him through, said nothing else. Morrison passed through the waiting room, went out into the hallway, and stopped. He couldn't breathe. He had failed. Maybe he'd ruined the most important chance of his life. At the end of the hallway was a small window, and Morrison walked there. The Los Angeles midday sun was bright. Cars were passing outside. People were walking. Life was going on. But Morrison's world had stopped. He leaned against the wall and sat on the floor. His hands were still shaking, but this time not from fear, from anger. He was angry at himself. Why had he been drinking? Why hadn't he prepared? Why did he always ruin everything? That morning when he left his room on Venice Beach, he'd made a promise to himself. This time would be different. This time he'd be professional. This time he wouldn't waste his chance. But he'd failed again. He'd been his own worst enemy again. 10 minutes later, the studio door opened, and Harold Levinson came out. He saw Morrison in the hallway, sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. Levinson stopped. For a moment, he thought about saying something to him, but then gave up. What could he say? Good luck. Better next time? But Levinson knew there wouldn't be a next time. Columbia Records wouldn't be calling this kid again. Levinson walked, got on the elevator, and left. Morrison watched him. When the elevator door closed, Morrison stood up, picked up his bag, and left the building. That night when Morrison returned to Venice Beach, his friends asked how it went. Morrison said, "Terrible," and didn't say anything else. For weeks he thought about that day, that moment in the studio, the disappointment on Levinson's face, the words, "Get out." He saw it in his dreams every night. But slowly he started to forget. Because life went on, and Morrison had other plans. Living on Venice Beach was cheap, but hard. Morrison was staying in a small room. When he couldn't pay rent, he slept on the beach. Sometimes he didn't eat for days. But he was writing poetry, playing guitar, and dreaming. He'd been kicked out of UCLA because he didn't go to classes, he cheated on exams, and he argued with teachers. But the real reason was something else. Morrison didn't fit the system. He rejected the rules, and this made him both free and lost. By early summer 1965, Morrison had almost given up. He wouldn't have a music career, he wouldn't sign a record deal, he'd never get on stage. Maybe he should go back. Maybe he should write a letter to his family. But then something happened. One night at a small bar called the London Fog, blues musicians were playing, and Morrison was watching. Among the artists was a keyboard player, energetic, passionate, someone who lived in the music. Morrison knew him. His name was Ray Manzarek, and they were friends from UCLA Film School. Ray didn't see Morrison, but Morrison watched him. And that night he understood something. Music wasn't something done alone. A group was needed. People were needed. Connection was needed. A few weeks later, Morrison and Ray ran into each other by chance on Venice Beach. The sun was setting. The beach was quiet. Waves were hitting the shore. Ray asked, "What are you doing these days?" Morrison said, "Writing." Ray was curious. "What are you writing?" Morrison hesitated. He hadn't shown his writing to anyone, but he trusted Ray. "Songs," he said. Ray smiled. "Sing me one." Morrison sang a song called Moonlight Drive, slowly, almost in a whisper. Ray froze. Morrison's voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of that drunk, unprepared kid. This voice had matured, deepened, strengthened. Ray said, "This is incredible." "Let's start a band." Morrison was surprised. "Are you serious?" Ray nodded. "Very serious. I've been looking for a vocalist like you. Let's do it." In fall 1965, the Doors were born. The name came from writer Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, Morrison's favorite. Morrison on vocals, Ray on keyboards, Robbie Krieger on guitar, John Densmore on drums. In the first rehearsals, nothing was perfect. Morrison had stage fright, sometimes forgot lyrics, sometimes came in on the wrong note. But the band was patient, because they all knew Morrison had something. That voice, that charisma, That dark energy existed in no one else. In early 1966, the Doors started giving their first live performances, in small bars, in almost empty halls, sometimes playing in front of just 5 or 6 people. But slowly, something was changing. As Morrison got used to the stage, he became more comfortable. He wasn't just singing anymore, he was performing. The way he held the microphone, the way he spread across the stage, the way he looked at the audience, everything was calculated but natural. And people were seeing this. In May 1966, the Whisky A Go Go Club offered the Doors a 6-week residency. This was a big opportunity. Whisky A Go Go was one of the most popular places on Sunset Strip. Hundreds of people came every night. Music industry professionals followed this place. The first week had average attendance, maybe 100 people. The second week, 200. The third week, 300. The fourth week, the venue was full. Lines were forming at the door. People couldn't get in, but still waited. Morrison's stage performance was becoming legendary. No one had seen anything like this. He wasn't just singing, he was performing a ritual. A dark, dangerous, hypnotic ritual. And everyone was mesmerized by him. By the end of the 6th week, record company representatives started coming. First small companies, then mid-sized producers, then big names. Everyone wanted to see the Doors. Everyone wanted to hear Morrison. And among them was a name, Harold Levinson. Columbia Records still employed him. He was still looking for new talent, and he'd heard a lot about the Doors. But he didn't remember Morrison. 2 years ago, he'd forgotten that drunk kid in that studio. He was just a name with "rejected" written in the records now. When Levinson came to Whisky A Go Go in January 1967, the place was packed. He couldn't find a spot in front of the stage, had to sit at the bar. When the lights went out, the crowd screamed. And when the Doors came on stage, Levinson saw Morrison for the first time. But he didn't recognize him, because this Morrison was no longer that kid. His hair had grown long, he was wearing leather pants, his gaze had sharpened, and his voice. That voice gave Levinson goosebumps. It seemed familiar, but he didn't know from where. The Doors started with "Break On Through," then played "Light My Fire," then finished with "The End." It was an epic 11-minute song. Morrison was almost in a trance. The audience was frozen. Levinson watched with his mouth open. This wasn't just music. This was an experience. When the concert ended, Levinson asked for permission to go backstage. The security guard first refused, but Levinson showed his card. Columbia Records. Security let him through. Backstage was dark and smoky. The band members were tired, but happy. Levinson found Morrison, extended his hand, and said, "Harold Levinson, Columbia Records." Morrison looked at him. His face seemed familiar, but he didn't know from where. Levinson smiled. "You don't remember me, do you?" Morrison shook his head. Levinson continued. "September 1964, Sunset Sound Studios. I kicked you out after 8 minutes." Morrison's face changed. Memories came back. All of them. His shaking hands, the broken whiskey bottle, the words, "Get out." That shame in the hallway. Levinson lowered his hand and said, "I made a mistake that day. You weren't talentless. You just weren't ready. But now you're ready. And Columbia wants you." Morrison didn't answer. Levinson continued. 3-album deal, full creative control. Studio, support, promotion, radio, television, everything. Morrison was still silent. Levinson said the numbers, 6-figure numbers. Morrison's eyes widened. This was a serious offer. Very serious. Levinson said, "Think about it and let me know," and handed him his business card. But Morrison didn't look at the card. He said, "No." Levinson was shocked. "No?" Morrison nodded. "You told me, get out. 2 years ago. In the studio. You didn't listen to me. Didn't give me a chance. 8 minutes was enough for you. And now you're here, because I started to succeed, because I don't need you anymore. But back then, I needed you, and you weren't there." Levinson opened his mouth, but Morrison continued. "Now I'm telling you the same thing. Get out." Levinson froze. Everyone backstage was watching them. Morrison didn't smile, just turned and walked to his band. Levinson just stood there, business card in hand, mouth open. Then he slowly turned around and left. Outside Whisky A Go Go, he stopped and breathed. What just happened? He'd been rejected by Morrison, and he deserved it. But the story didn't end there, because Morrison's rejection wasn't just revenge. It was a message. He was no longer the old Morrison. He no longer needed people's pity, their chances, their approval. He was powerful now, and he didn't have to share this power with anyone. That night, Levinson sat in his hotel room and thought. Morrison was right. He had really made a mistake. Not just against Morrison, but against himself. Because he'd forgotten that his job wasn't just to find the perfect one, but to see potential. The next morning, when Levinson returned to his office, he reported to his boss. The doors were magnificent, but they didn't want us. The boss was surprised. Why? Levinson couldn't lie. He told the whole story. The 1964 audition, the broken bottle, the moment he said, "Get out." The boss listened and stayed silent. Then he said, "You're fired." Levinson was shocked. "What?" the boss repeated. "You're fired. If you make another mistake like this, losing someone like Morrison is unforgivable." Levinson bowed his head. He was right. The Doors signed with Elektra Records later that month. A visionary producer named Jack Holtzman gave Morrison complete freedom, was generous with money, and most importantly, believed in him. For the first time, Morrison felt valued. For the first time, someone had said yes to him, and this changed everything. When the Doors' first album was released in April 1967, it was just titled The Doors. Simple, bold, unforgettable. The album reviews were positive, but sales were slow the first week. But then the radio started playing Light My Fire, and suddenly the Doors were everywhere. People were buying the album. Concerts were selling out. Morrison's face was appearing on magazine covers. In July 1967, Light My Fire reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Morrison was 23 years old and had become one of the world's most popular rock stars. When Levinson heard that album, he was sitting in his office with his head in his hands. In every song was Morrison's voice, that dark, deep, unforgettable voice. And every song reminded Levinson, "You lost this. You rejected this." His secretary asked if he was okay. Levinson said, "I'm fine." But he wasn't. He'd made the biggest mistake of his career. He'd seen Morrison, heard his voice, and rejected him. Now that voice was playing everywhere in the world, and it carried Elektra's logo, not Columbia's. When the Doors' second album, Strange Days, came out in 1968, Levinson listened again, was impressed again, regretted again. He wrote Morrison a letter, apologized, confessed his mistakes, and asked for another chance. But Morrison didn't respond, because Morrison wasn't interested in the past. He was looking to the future, and his future was bright. In 1969, Touch Me reached #1. In 1970, Roadhouse Blues became a classic. Morrison wasn't just a musician anymore, he was a cultural icon. Young people followed him, poets were inspired by him, even the government saw him as a threat. Morrison's story wasn't just a rejection story, it was also a transformation story. In 1964, in that studio, he was a drunk, unprepared, scared kid. But the Morrison who took the stage in 1967 was a man who challenged the world, broke the rules, feared nothing. The difference between them wasn't 2 years. The difference between them was belief. Morrison now believed in himself, and this belief made him a star. When Levinson heard Morrison had died in 1971, he really cried. His secretary was surprised. She'd never seen her boss like this. Levinson said, "I knew him a long time ago, and I lost him." The secretary didn't understand what he meant. But Levinson didn't explain. He just sat, put on the doors. The end, and listened. Morrison's voice was still powerful, still dark, still unforgettable. And every time Levinson heard that voice, he remembered that September day in 1964, the broken bottle, the fallen microphone, and those two words he said, "Get out." Today, the recordings of Morrison's first audition are still in Columbia's archives. Never released, never played. But sometimes when young musicians come to Columbia for auditions, the old sound technicians tell that story. Jim Morrison's 8-minute audition, the broken whiskey bottle, the "get out" sentence. And then they add, "If someone tells you you're not good enough, prove them wrong." Morrison did. And he changed the world. Morrison's rejection wasn't his end. It was his beginning. Because sometimes life tests us. Sometimes doors close in our faces. Sometimes someone tells us, "Get out." But what matters isn't going through that door. What matters is creating our own door. Morrison did that. He waited 2 years, worked, changed. And when he came back, he didn't need anyone anymore. Because he had become a door himself. And millions of people passed through that door. They still do.